it's Tanya, and today I wanted to talk about some books that talk about survivors and how they survived some crazy life circumstances. So, the books that I'm going to go over are Finding Me, A Decade of Darkness, A Life Reclaimed, a memoir of the Cleveland kidnapping by Michelle Knight, and she had some help from Michelle Burford. Life After Darkness, Finding Healing and Happiness After the Cleveland Kidnappings. Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland, Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, Mary Jordan, and Kevin Sullivan. The first three actually kind of go together because they're regarding the same event, and they're about the Cleveland kidnappings. It's the stories of Michelle Knight, who now goes by Lily, so I'm going to call her Lily today, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus. Their stories go between three different books because Michelle Knight has written her own two books. She gives more background about her life before and life after. In the book that Gina DeJesus and Amanda Berry wrote, they wrote together as their shared experiences. I want to start with Lily's books. There was this time that she was going through a really troubling life circumstance because her family was not very supportive. They allowed her to be abused, things like that. She had a child and somebody had hurt her child, so the child welfare system had kind of stepped in. So how she was abducted, she was going and trying to go on a visit with her child, and this man, his name was Ariel Castro, he decided that he was going to be selfish and he was going to abduct her and take her from where she was trying to go to. So he gets her to come into the house because he has a daughter that Lily knows of. So Lily is able to go into the house because she feels welcomed, and because, he's like, my daughter's home, she's just taking a shower, so you'll see her, you can come on in and you can say hi. And so she comes in, but the only thing is the daughter isn't there, and he decides to capture her and abduct her and keep her in his home and do awful things to her. For example, he assaults her in various ways, and he keeps her in his home for years and years and years. I think it was over 13 years, if I'm remembering correctly. But she has to go through her story of how she survived these life circumstances when this man was abusing her all along the way. Then kind of comes in Amanda and Gina's story. Lily talks about them as well. But altogether, Amanda and Gina DeJesus, they both were also abducted, and their circumstances were very similar. They knew of the family, he got them in the house, and then he didn't let them go. So again, he would abuse them in front of each other, he would abuse them just on their own. It has always been confusing to me, like, how can you do this to multiple different women? And he would even give them excuses like, I'm a sick man, you guys are helping me not be sick towards other people. And they're like, well, what about us? We deserve to not be abused as well. And he just would come up with excuses, and he would continue to harm them. And so they continued to live in his home under his abuse, and eventually they would start getting different privileges, which I put in air quotes. It was just some basic human rights. And eventually he gets Amanda pregnant, and so she has Ariel Castro's child. And when this baby comes along, he starts to change a little bit. He starts being a little bit nicer. He'll take the little girl out of the house and take her around. He'll let them go outside as long as they wear ridiculous disguises. And this is kind of what leads to his downfall, is the daughter. He starts being a little bit more trusting of them all. And so eventually Amanda wasn't locked up one day, and she's able to escape. And so she breaks down a door. She's yelling for help. People aren't really helping her from her perspective. She had to break down the door herself. She gets out. They call the police, and that's when they rescue the other two, Gina and Lily, and explaining how their escape was and what it looked like. And in Lily's second book, she talks about, what does life look like after you escape? Because your life doesn't just completely get better all of a sudden. Like, you're traumatized and the world doesn't exactly want to help you out. They just want you to be like, oh, great, what a great story. Let me get your story. And they're not around to help support the survivors. And so she did receive some assistance, but it was just trying to transition back into the world when the world is completely different than she left. And for example, she isn't able to get in contact with her son because he's been adopted. They thought that she just left and wasn't around because her family didn't really put out missing persons and things like that. They didn't really try that much. And so that was one of the things that Ariel Castro would use against her, is like, oh, you're not even on the news like these other two girls. You're like not as important as them, I guess. And so it's just this time that she's trying to be like, well, my family wasn't supportive. I lived on the streets before I was abducted for quite some time, and she's going through all of her life, and it kind of goes through more of her time while she was with Ariel Castro, but the main part of it was life afterwards. And thankfully she was able to find love and she was able to get married. I'm just happy that her life got better from there, because I can imagine the recovery process is something that I can't even understand at all. So I'm very impressed by their stories and the resilience that they can show through all of it, because I can't imagine being in the position that they were put in. Something that I liked about Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland, the one that Amanda and Gina wrote, was they also had Mary Jordan and Kevin Sullivan, because they were the journalists. They were able to put in their input of what was happening on the outside when these girls were abducted. And I think it was a really good view on that life is still happening outside of this home that they're stuck in, and their families cared about them. They wanted them to be around. They had this hope. And so I thought it was a nice journalistic addition to it, because you got to see both sides, the life inside and the life outside. Another book of survival that I recently read, and I had been holding out on reading it because I just felt like it had to be overrated, but it's I Am Malala, the story of the girl who stood up for education and was shot by the Taliban. And she had assistance by Christina. Again, I had held out and I hadn't read the book because it was like so popular and so commonly put out there that I don't know. I just assumed that it was something that was blown out of proportion, but it wasn't. It was so good. It was talking about this girl named Malala, and she lived in Swat Valley in Pakistan, and it was talking about how her dad was really passionate about education and educating the youths of the world and of their area. And at that time, girls going to school in their area were not given the education that boys were. And even boys were not getting the education because it costs money to go to school in that area rather than just something that the government puts in place. And so I thought it was really interesting, because a lot of their excuses of why, school isn't important, or like school isn't as high on their kind of radar, was some to do with religion around there. They're Muslim individuals, and so a lot of them have very strict religious beliefs, and a lot of that did not include an education. It had to do with, following the rules and following the guidelines and different things like that. And so it was a really cool view into another culture and another way of life that I don't live. And so it was cool to see how they lived at that time. And it also goes through the history of the politicians and the government that they had, because it just changed throughout time. And some government officials and politicians were good, and then a lot of them were not so good. And so it talks about how eventually the Taliban came into existence, and at first they weren't seen as a bad thing. It was just like a group of people, and eventually they turned into very religious, oppressive group. And so they started implementing all of these rules that really started becoming scary, because they were implementing implementing them to the point where they would hurt people, and eventually they'd start killing people because they weren't following the rules. For example, women were supposed to wear head coverings and like cover their face, but Malala and her family, they didn't really do that in public. They just wore the head, scarf and covering. I think it's hijab is what it was called, but it was really interesting because the Taliban was really wanting them to follow the rules. Women were not supposed to be educated, and they just started taking over the area and starting to do like worse and worse things over the time. Eventually, her and her father started doing a lot of advocacy work because they didn't like that girls and kids and people were not being educated. So they started speaking out, and they became activists for education and for getting people the rights that they deserved as human beings. Her advocacy started picking up steam, and she was starting to become known, and she was starting to get awards. She was starting to get all these things. Eventually, the Taliban didn't like that because she's, encouraging education. She's encouraging freedom. She's encouraging basic human rights. And eventually, they decided to attack her, and they actually did take credit. So they shot her on her school bus, point blank, right in the face. And so it went through her process of healing as well as the scariness of it, because at first they didn't think it was a big deal, but eventually they realized it was something very severe, and she had to get all these surgeries, and she had nerves even in her face that were damaged, and so they had to do surgeries for that. And she got shot in the face, and so it was talking about all of the damage that occurred and all the work that they had to do to help her to survive that. So she bounced kind of between some hospitals, and eventually she ended up in another country. And so staff and the people were having a hard time getting her there because her government didn't want the family the ability to stay in that country rather than stay in their own country and ask for help. They didn't want to look bad to all the other countries. And so I thought it was interesting because it's like, just save this girl, just let her be saved, but there's all these politics that are involved. But her government did end up paying for her medical bills, and I thought that was interesting because they weren't being very supportive before that. Despite all of this stuff that was happening to her and all of these, injuries and illnesses and all of these things, she was still advocating for people, and she was still advocating for education for girls, for women, for kids, for men, for everybody, because she felt like it was a basic human right to have an education. And I thought, I don't know, I don't know exactly why I was holding off on reading it, but I think, her, Christina Lamb and Malala did a really good job at telling the story and going through the history. And I had only heard of like Saddam Hussein, and I didn't realize that it's all these other people that were causing all these problems, and like doing all this stuff. So I didn't realize that there were a lot of other players that I didn't know about. But again, that's just a lack of education on my part, because I wasn't paying a lot of attention then. It was more of like, oh, that's not good that all of this is happening. But anyway, again, I think I liked the history part of it and learning like what was going on at the time. So my tip of the day would be read books, even if it seems like it's something that's going to be overrated, or maybe it's going to be something that's actually beneficial for you, and like something that could be exciting and something for you to learn. And sometimes memoirs can be a little brutal. I was just really encouraged by a lot of these books. They showed a lot of hope and bravery, and I just really feel encouraged by these strong women that were able to survive these life circumstances. So that's all I have for today. That being said, I hope that you have a wonderful day. Don't talk to strangers unless they give you candy, and I'll see you next time. Bye.